My name is Ali Norell, and I'm standing here because my daughter died. My book, The Truth Inside, is about the experiences I had following the death of my youngest daughter, Romy, almost 5 years ago. And it's important to give some background here. I was brought up with this stuff. It's part of my makeup from a young age. I didn't have an epiphany. I'm not a previously skeptical convert to spiritualism. My beliefs didn't assure my safe passage through the mire of grief I encountered after my daughter's death. And I remain open to the possibility that I'm completely wrong, because I, or anyone else, can't prove the experiences that I had. I'm not seeking to change anybody's mind either, or to persuade them to my way of thinking. I like to point out now, I respect all religions just as much as I respect a person's choice not to believe in anything. As long as they harm no one, surely all beliefs have a place in the world. This book is not on a mission to convert anyone, so this begs the question, why did I write it? I promised Romy I would write about her. I know that sounds a little outlandish. She was 4 months old when she died, very suddenly. But as she lay in the paediatric intensive care unit that night, I promised her that the world would know her name, because every parent's worry after a child dies is that nobody will remember them, that nobody will speak of them or say their name. I wrote this book for Romy to honour that promise and to make sure that her life is remembered, and not just by me and her family. I also wrote it for myself. After the first counsellor I was sent began to cry 5 minutes into our meeting, I realised it was going to be very difficult for me to share how I truly felt with anyone. I wanted to protect those close to me from the details, but I also wanted to discuss what had happened without fear of shocking people. And there was another aspect. I did attempt some bereavement groups and online forums, but not one of these entertained the possibility that our loved ones might perhaps continue after death. And that's a prospect I found very upsetting, given that the beliefs I grew up with, and also the need that I had to feel that my daughter continued to exist somewhere in some form. Eventually, to help myself and to give others an understanding of what I was experiencing, I began to write it all down, and I was surprised at how easily it came. In fact, I would say that I was given this book, just as I believe that I was given my daughter. As the late Barbara Bush said following the death of her young daughter, Robin, the death of a child is so painful, both emotionally and spiritually, that I truly wondered if my own heart and spirit would ever heal. I soon learned that I could help myself by helping others. I really hope that my book might offer some form of help to others living without their children or loved ones. I hope that some people might recognise some events from their own lives that were perhaps not so insignificant after all. I hope that someone feeling the immeasurable pain of grief might find it within themselves to open their mind and their heart and to consider possibilities beyond the beliefs that they hold. I hope that perhaps it will help others to see, as I learned to see, that even the worst kind of suffering in life can yield a valuable lesson, that through the most difficult experiences we can become a better person, that our life can still have meaning. These are some of the messages of my book. Writing this book also led me to what I believe is my purpose in life. It's a bittersweet feeling to think that had Romy not existed and had she not died, I may not have realised my dream of becoming a published author. Romy gave me a gift in helping me to realise my true potential. Romy was a perfectly healthy baby, born in a wonderful home birth at the end of a happy, healthy pregnancy. I always wanted to have lots of children, and as our third child, she was very much wanted. For 4 months, I had the blessed experience of truly feeling as if there wasn't a single thing in life that I lacked. To coin a cliche, my world was complete. And then, on July the 18th, 2014, within a very short space of time, Romy became seriously unwell, and within 48 hours, she was dead. The best that the doctors could tell us, following a battery of tests, was that she'd suffered some kind of neurological episode akin to an aneurysm. It was apparently so sudden, so fast, and so immense that even one of the country's best neurosurgeons was at a loss as to what to do. The nature of her passing, as sudden as it was, contributed to the cataclysmic levels of shock and trauma that we experienced. Nature is a wonderful thing, though, because it somehow initially blocks out some of your remembered experience to allow you to continue to function in some way. This is called being in shock. Writing the book was cathartic for me in many ways, but one particularly important part of the process was that it allowed me to recall some things that my mind had previously blocked out. It became important for me to remember these details, as to me, they're all part of Romy's time here, and I didn't want to forget any of it. This is apparently a common block with grief. We hang on to it in some ways as it represents memory of our loved one, and we can't bear to let it go. We can't bear to let go any part of them, even our pain at their absence. We want to hang on to all of it so that we can feel that they are still very much in our lives. Once my shock wore off, I can say that possibly the only way I'm standing here now is down to my 2 older children, my husband and my close family, who gave me a reason to keep going when I really didn't want to. I want to reiterate here that I'm not presenting a cure for grief in this book. I experienced grief in all the rawness and cruelty that it is possible to feel it, and I had many moments when I felt that I couldn't carry on. I still experience some of that rawness at times. It doesn't wear off, you don't get over it, or move on. Time is not the great healer it's cracked up to be. Post-traumatic stress disorder means that it can still, at times, feel as if it's all happened very recently, and I have had lots of help. My grief has been a very real experience, so please be under no illusion that I escaped any part of it thanks to my spiritual beliefs. So I was brought up with an interest in the spiritual and the esoteric, and the biggest gift my parents gave to me, other than their love and my first typewriter, was the ability to have an open mind. My husband has a deep interest in Buddhist philosophy, and one of their main tenets is the capacity for non-attachment, for accepting what is. I think that as a human race we're very poor at this. It's as if we somehow think that life is poking fun at us if we accept things without question, and so we push and we force and we seek to control and find answers and proof and evidence. I'm not for 1 minute saying that this approach shouldn't exist, because where would we be without science and evaluation? But I do believe that we have lost our ability to accept some things without question. Needing proof for everything is not a balanced state. Many people, for example, believe in God, and this brings them great hope, positivity and comfort in their lives, but we can't prove that God exists any more than I can prove to you that life continues after we die. When Romy died, we felt no immediate need for answers. We didn't run around questioning the medical professionals, looking for someone to blame, desperate for a concrete piece of information to put on her death certificate, because it didn't matter to us. It wasn't going to bring her back, and we didn't believe it was going to save anyone else's child. We felt that it was only going to cause pain to us and to others who felt bad at not having been able to save her, and as her mother, I knew that she had gone long before she actually physically took her last breath. I can't explain this. It was when I was still at our home with Romy before we were transferred to 2 hospitals, when I had realised that she wasn't conscious. There was a moment when the emergency services operator asked me a question, and I looked at my baby lying on the sofa, strangely on the exact spot where I had given birth to her 4 months earlier, and I had a moment of devastating realisation. I just knew that she had gone. Of course, I continued to hope desperately that I was wrong, that something could be done, that I would hand her over to doctors who would perform a miracle, but deep in my heart I knew at that moment that the essence of her was no longer there. To corroborate this, my sister, who is a nurse of many years' experience, she's a ward sister, she sat with us overnight with Romy in the ICU at King's, and at one point she told me, "You do realise she's not there." She felt it too, and she's a very practical person of a far more scientific persuasion than I am. So this is an example to me of recognising the deeper truth to an external situation. I could easily have dismissed this feeling, refused to acknowledge it, or told myself I was crazy, but I chose instead to listen to it because it gave me a different and actually later on a very helpful perspective on an incredibly painful situation. Having had a lifelong interest in matters of the spirit, I assumed that it would be to this that I turned in the aftermath of my daughter's death, but actually it wasn't. I read avidly all the books by Elizabeth Kübler-Ross on death and grief, in which she speaks of the infamous 5 stages of grief, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Oblivious to my ignorance of stage 1, denial, I blithely told my husband one day that I seemed to have sailed through the whole bereavement experience, and what's more, I had sidestepped the anger part. His lack of comment should have alerted me, but it didn't. And it turned out that I was very angry. And in particular, I was angry at the world of spiritualism and mediumship, because this had been a part of my life for as long as I can remember, and I couldn't get to grips with the idea that if I was supposed to have developed such great mediumship skills, why on earth hadn't I been able to predict what was going to happen to my own daughter? So firstly, to explain what is mediumship. Mediumship is the ability to connect to an energy for which many different names exist: spirit, God, the universe, universal energy, and to receive information from individuals who have died. Basically, talking to dead people. Psychic ability does not do this. Psychics can read a person's energy field and discern information about the living individual sitting in front of them. A medium may possess psychic abilities, but a psychic is not a medium. I will assert that we all have psychic ability to an extent. A mother always has a psychic instinct when it comes to her child, for example. And we all experience gut feelings and instincts about different situations in life, but we don't always trust them. A medium or a psychic has more than likely pursued these experiences, sought to learn about them, and strengthen their abilities to sense what is happening outside the concrete. I describe my abilities as psychic mediumship, and since I was a child, I've been highly sensitive to atmospheres, people, and places. I often had strong feelings about different situations and was lucky enough to have parents who did not tell me not to be silly. As I got older, I chose to develop these skills, in particular mediumship, following some experiences I had as a teenager. So it's fair to say that from a young age, I developed the habit of checking and trusting my feelings, my instinct. I spent many years developing my mediumship skills, but have never worked with them on a professional level, and cannot imagine that I ever will. It's something that I live with, and I feel comfortable that I have accepted this ability as a part of my life. If I had denied it, shut it down, or been afraid of it, I don't believe that this would have been healthy for me. Contrary to what some people think, this sense cannot be turned off, on and off at will. It can't be used for insincere purposes, like lottery numbers, for example, and it's not a party trick that can be performed at random. In my opinion, using psychic or mediumistic skills is a bit like preparing to meditate or to pray or any other act of devotion. It's a spiritual practice requiring respect, time and attention, and the correct intentions. There are many opinions regarding mediumship, and I'm sure there are plenty in the room today, and just as with any profession or practice, there are some individuals who are more skilled, more honest, or more well-intentioned than others. Historically, the worlds of science and spirituality have stood apart. But over the past few years, science has tentatively begun to acknowledge the possibility that consciousness can exist after death. The work of Dr. Sam Parnier at the University of Southampton, for example, on near-death experiences, is the closest we've come so far to the worlds of science and spirit overlapping. The work of Dr. Julie Beischel at the Windbridge Institute in the United States includes initiating a testing system for mediumship, which is very exciting. Dr. Beischel has set up a system whereby mediums, and who do not use their skills for money, so these are mediums who don't receive monetary reward in turn for giving information, they're tested using a variety of different criteria, and the results are really compelling. The reason that mediumship plays such a big part in my story is that having spent years developing my abilities, and having spent most of my life trusting my instincts beyond all else, it was a bitter blow to me that they had apparently let me down when it came to Romy. All the anger in my angry phase was directed at spiritualism for letting me down, and at myself for failing to keep my child alive, and for failing to predict what would happen. The conclusion I have come to regarding why I wasn't able to intuit what was going to happen is that for some reason it was all meant to happen exactly as it did, because there was something that I and my husband were meant to learn on a spiritual level. On a human level, we've experienced tremendous suffering, and it will be easy to claim that it isn't fair, that we didn't deserve it, or that it shouldn't have happened. However, had I had any kind of forewarning about her death, I would of course have done anything in my power to prevent it. And if you start on that pathway and follow it to the point of, but what if someone had told you when you were pregnant that that was going to happen, then all kinds of moral dilemmas open up. I think that ultimately we have to trust that we cannot control life, and that the abilities we open up and develop as mediums are not always meant to be used to prevent human suffering, because as much as we might not like it, without suffering, there's not much to learn. Sometimes you have to go into the darkness to experience the light. I had dramatically turned my back on the world of spirit, but in the weeks immediately following Romy's death, a handful of things happened which I found confusing and difficult to explain. I had strange prophetic dreams. Things moved in the house, and on 2 separate occasions I saw Romy as plain as day. I started to think I might be going mad, but still I didn't want to give room to my old beliefs. They did niggle at me though, and one evening I found myself debating whether or not to visit a local spiritualist church, a practice I'd adopted on and off for most of my adult life. If you've never been to a spiritualist church, basically it's a smallish hall with rows of chairs set up in front of a low platform like a stage. There's a table with some flowers and perhaps a nice statue on it, and the medium will sit at this table. The people assembled will begin by singing uplifting songs to raise the energy vibration in the room. Someone will give an address on a spiritual topic, and then the medium will give what's called a demonstration of mediumship, where they will ask to speak to whomever they feel drawn to in the assembled group and give them messages from their loved ones in spirit. The most convincing messages are often more to do with Auntie Barbara's love of pickled onions or Uncle Wilf's whistling hearing aid than any great spiritual revelations, because this is what most reminds us of our loved ones who have died and shows us that they're still around, that they still exist, albeit in another dimension. It's the small details that count. If we were given reams of information about the other side and how fantastic it is, I doubt that anyone would want to be here living their lives. Some aspects of life and death need to remain a mystery. So I went to a church I had found. I didn't speak to a single person once I got there. I didn't receive a message from the medium on the platform, and I returned home in tears and told my husband that I was never setting foot in anywhere like that ever again. And I'd like to read you my account of what happened after this. Imagine my husband's surprise when a mere 2 weeks later I blithely asked him, "Would you mind if I went out to the Spiritualist church this evening?" "What, you mean the one that you are never setting foot in ever again?" came his reply. Once again I found myself en route to a place where spiritualists gather, all the while asking myself what on earth I thought I was doing. I thought that I'd left this part of my life behind me. I drove there alone, in silence except for the one-sided conversation I was holding with Romy. "Romy," I said out loud to my empty car, "I said I wasn't coming back to this place, but I know there's a reason why I am. I know in my heart that you're okay, but I'm still your mummy and I miss you desperately, and I really just need to hear from you that you're okay. I need to hear it from you, that's all." The medium giving the demonstration that night was a lively, vivacious woman who explained that she receives information extremely fast and gives it just as quickly. She asked us not to be unnerved that she appeared to be barking out messages, and assured us that she would be around to answer questions afterwards for those of us who needed to ask them. I sat at the back of the crowded hall, having once again checked and double-checked that my locket was well hidden underneath my clothes and the light scarf I had wound around my neck as I left the house. I knew with absolute certainty that she was going to give me a message, and I knew that I would be the third person she came to. I had a barrage of information at me from 1 or 2 deceased relatives before saying that she saw a very young girl, a baby. She said, "You're wearing a locket around your neck with a lock of her hair and a photograph in it, and you hold this locket and talk to her a lot." This was absolutely correct, down to the precise way that she was showing me I held this locket. Aside from this, information concerning Romy was fairly scant, and she was about to direct her beam onto the next person when she said, "I'm being told I must tell you something, but that my choice of words is very, very important." I waited with bated breath, expecting some kind of lengthy eulogy from spirit. Instead, she said, "They're really stressing that the way I tell you this is of the utmost importance, and it's only 2 words. They're telling me to tell you, I'm okay." I found as if the breath had been knocked out of my body. If anybody out there can tell me how this woman, having never met me before, and having had no way of overhearing what I'd asked my deceased daughter to tell me, out loud, in my car, alone, just 1 hour previously, could have come up with these uncannily specific 2 words, then I'm all ears. Despite my beliefs and my grief-stricken desperation to want to believe what she told me, I still willed myself to find a way to discount it because it's almost too much to take in. I had asked Romy directly to tell me herself that she was okay. Through that medium, she told me, I'm okay. And for those of you thinking that there's no way a 4-month-old baby could have known or used words, please remember that once Romy passed her spirit, I believe she was no longer a being in human baby form, but a soul returning from whence she came. So over a period of several months, I found myself then visiting a small number of spiritual mediums, and one by one they all either corroborated or told me about a happening that I had experienced connected to Romy. And this is what I feel makes the subject matter of the book take on a slightly more interesting angle. Because as I've explained, I've had experiences like this my whole life. They feel normal to me. I could have just recounted them in a book, but I have no evidence and I can't prove any of it. It's just my word on my experiences. I should say that I haven't always blindly accepted any of these experiences without question, but generally speaking, I am open to them and I'll almost always come down on the side of believing, eventually. However, with these particular experiences concerning my daughter, my belief had been shaken by my grief, and what I found very compelling is that every single one of the experiences I had was at some point brought up by any one of several mediums. With the exception of one who's a former tutor and a friend who knows me, none of the others knew me. They hadn't met me before, they didn't know anything about my background, and yet they were all able to refer to what had been happening in my home and address the questions I'd been asking myself about Romy's spiritual purpose in this life. And I find that extraordinary. Bearing in mind that none of us can ever possibly really know the entire truth of what exists beyond this life while we're still in it, I've done my best to record those personal experiences, and I've attempted to explain them according to what I've learned and therefore what I've come to believe. The main points are that I believe we learn from all experiences in life, on a human level and on a spiritual one. I believe there's a possibility that we somehow choose this learning, perhaps before we're born. And I believe that our loved ones are not lost or gone. I believe that their essence somehow continues after their death. Incidentally, you may have noticed I do consciously use the terms death and dying, although I am pressing the point that our loved ones in some ways don't die. And for the purposes of clarity, I'm using these terms because they're easily recognisable to all of us, regardless of our spiritual persuasion. Despite widespread scepticism, there's currently a huge appetite for all things spiritual. Particularly in these difficult and unpredictable times in the world, there's a need for something other, something in which we feel we can believe, some kind of reassurance that the world can be a place of acceptance and love. It's easy to feel isolated in these beliefs because, just like death, nobody talks about them very openly. Let's face it, if you look back in history, I would have been burned at the stake for standing here uttering such thoughts out loud. And yet something that I encounter almost every time I venture to speak about spirituality is that almost everyone has a story, sometimes the most unlikely people. Last year I was asked to participate in an article for a national tabloid newspaper about belief in an afterlife, the modern-day equivalent of being burned at the stake. I spoke to a journalist and was then invited to their offices for a photo shoot, which is frankly my idea of hell. Apart from my intense dislike of having my photo taken, I was terrified of having to meet hard-nosed journos and photographers who would more than likely mock the article I was quoted in and make fun of me as some kind of deranged hippie. But just 5 minutes after I'd arrived, while sitting in hair and makeup, the makeup artist assigned to me was chatting away conspiratorially about her experiences since her grandmother had died a few months previously. A while later, 2 photographers were yelling instructions at me, physically repositioning parts of my body and talking about which shots would work as if I wasn't there, while a young intern blasted a hairdryer into my face to ensure that my hair had the right level of lift. I was distinctly uncomfortable. One of the photographers shouted across the studio, "Are you the one in the article about the afterlife?" I said yes, and to my astonishment, just as I made to leave, the photographer who had shouted at me sidled over to me and muttered, "I had a near-death experience." I ended up suggesting a number of books on the afterlife and left feeling ashamed at having judged a group of people just as I had thought they might judge me. For me, seeking out the spiritual meaning connected to my daughter's death was an important facet of my learning to balance the duality of my whole experience of bereavement, that is, the human and the spiritual. While researching this talk, I looked up some of the vast wisdom of Eckhart Tolle, who has stood on this very spot, and was amazed to find that he speaks of exactly this aspect. So on a spiritual level, I get it. I think that Romy wasn't supposed to be here for long. I know that we all agreed for this to happen so that we would advance in our spiritual learning in some way. In that way, I can accept it, and I can almost find peace with it. On a human level, though, as her mother, I can't accept it at all. I feel anger and despair that she's not here where she should be with me, growing up alongside her brothers and sister. Eckhart Tolle has the following thoughts. The natural way of being after death of a loved one is suffering at first. Then there is a deepening. In that deepening, you go to a place where there is no death. Conditioned as your mind is by society, the contemporary world that you live in, your mind then tells you that there's something wrong with this. Your mind says, I shouldn't be feeling peace. That is not what one feels in a situation like this. But that's a conditioned thought by the culture that you live in. It doesn't mean that the waves of sadness don't come back from time to time, but in between the waves of sadness, you sense there is peace. As you sense that peace, you sense the essence of your children as well, the timeless essence. So death is a very sacred thing, not just a dreadful thing. When you react to the loss of form, that's dreadful. Death can help you find the sacred dimension of life, where life is indestructible. I think those are very powerful words, and they've inspired me a lot in my own journey, my grieving process. It doesn't help that death is still very much a taboo subject in our society, and as Byron Katie observed, death has a terrible reputation. Another reason for my choosing to share my experiences is to encourage more dialogue about death. If you look at the word bereavement, you'll find that it is rooted in an old Germanic word meaning to rob or to snatch. So we can see from this that it's no new idea that death somehow robs us of our loved ones, that it takes them away. But how do we explain the many people who insist that they still feel the presence of their loved ones after death, that they dream of conversations with them and believe that they have seen them? Is it just imagination? We fear death. We personalise it as the bogeyman, the grim reaper. Why? Because we perceive that death separates us, and yet it is a small jump to consider the possibility that if some kind of essence perhaps exists outside our physical form, how is it impossible that this essence cannot surround us? There are so many poems and songs that tell us that those who have died are just in the next room, in our hearts, that they live on. This is what we want to believe, so why do we so readily dismiss occurrences that support this idea? As a society, we still don't really know what to say about death and dying, and when a child has died, even less so. Several recent movements, such as the Death Midwives, created by Felicity Warner, and the Death Cafe, have really moved us forward in this respect. Death midwives, or death doulas as they're known, are those who sit with the dying. And this is particularly interesting given that historically the wise woman of the village was midwife to those being ushered in or out of life. The Death Cafe movement, founded by John Underwood, who himself died in 2017 at the age of 44, aims to encourage the meeting of those who are interested in discussing death and why we fear it over tea and cake. Just terribly British. The most promising aspect of both these initiatives is that they are very much normalising death, embracing it as a part of life, and accepting that it happens to everybody, young or old. By seeing death in a more positive light, surely the impact on how we experience grief will shift too. I would like to come finally to the truth of my book title. I'm sorry if this is disappointing, but I'm not promising the unveiling of the meaning of life here, and I don't hold any deep spiritual secrets. I haven't channeled anything exciting. Knowledge about our paths in life that I believe we are all born knowing. The intuition that we all brush aside and seek explanations for, the part of us that cannot be destroyed, even by grief, and which, if it's paid attention to, can lead us in directions in which our learning is great. Even if we are aware of this truth, ultimately, in all situations, there exists choice. We can choose to believe only in what is in front of us. We can choose to have faith in something we cannot see. We can choose to give up in adversity or find meaning and thrive. For what it's worth, I believe that we somehow choose our earthly experiences before we are born, and that these experiences are carefully curated for us to learn as much as possible about compassion, acceptance, and love. We cannot control our lives or the lives of others. We cannot avoid the difficulties, and it is often from hardship and suffering that we learn the most about ourselves and others. I believe that we all know our own truth, and that the closer we get to it through the choices we make, the more meaningful our lives will be. In his wonderful book, Man's Search for Meaning, the Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl wrote, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. There is always choice. And for anyone who questions me as to how useful it is to choose to believe in an other, a spirit world, the existence of life after death, I say this: I have watched them lower my child's body into the ground. I have to continue living my own life. As a mother, the belief that the essence of my daughter continues to exist somewhere, in some form, helps me to feel that her presence here was meaningful and that it might yet be meaningful to others. And that's a really important thing and a great gift. Given a choice between that and the bleak scenario of believing her to be gone forever without a trace, I know which belief would enhance my time here and which would dog it with negativity. I would rather believe in something that gives me hope, but which may perhaps turn out not to be true, than spend my life denying the existence of anything that I can't see or prove. When I'm gone from here, it won't matter anyway. I choose to believe in my own truth. Thank you for allowing me to share it with you. Well, the question is, when present in a spiritualist church and the medium comes to, so they'll come to somebody and there's the lady over here in the blue jacket, can I speak with you? They will then possibly say, okay, I can see a gentleman standing next to you, he's wearing a green jacket, he has a hat with a feather in it, and they will describe a person in quite some detail. So my answer to that question would be, it does vary from person to person because it depends how that person receives their information. So speaking for myself, I have a certain amount of mediumistic ability, and when I see something, I see it in my mind's eye. So I tend to sense a presence, usually behind me on one side or another. I can only describe the way in which a medium often knows who they are to connect with. Some people will say that they see a light, a physical light over that person. Other people will just be scanning the room and they will just feel like they need to zero in on one particular person. I believe that some mediums do actually physically see, and they will see the person as if they are standing next to you. I believe that the majority of us will have an image in our mind's eye, which is why you often will see a medium closing their eyes, because it's like a cinema screen on your forehead here, and you're sometimes seeing as if it's like a film playing out, and then you can see the person, and sometimes you'll get a close face and you'll pick up details that way. How did I see her? Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I physically saw her. It's never happened to me before, possibly once when I was quite young. But with those two experiences, I did physically see her. On one, we used to have a practice. We would take all our kids have co-slept with us. They sleep in the bed. So we used to bring her up to bed with us. We had a little nighttime ritual, and we'd put her down in the bed. And my husband would kind of shuttle out of the bathroom. So we were sort of in and out of the bedroom so that somebody was with her. And I was coming up the stairs, and I passed our bedroom door, and I looked, and she was in the bed. She was really in the bed, and I looked away, and I looked back, and she was still there. And that actually happened on 3 consecutive nights. And actually on the third night, I got very upset by it, and I just said, stop. I said out loud, please stop, I can't see it, and it never happened again after that. Then the second time I saw her, I was in our home, I was playing a piece of music that I found very emotional, and it was connected. It was an artist who creates beach art to honour children and babies who have died. And so she shared something on her Facebook page that I was playing, so I had Romy very much in my mind, and I walked through into our conservatory, and I was just looking out at the rose bushes we had planted for her in the garden, and I just had this overpowering feeling that I needed to turn round, and when I turned round I saw her. We used to put her in her little bouncy chair next to where my husband sat and worked in the conservatory, and she was right there, and that was maybe about 5 seconds, and then I turned away. When I looked back at her, gone. That one kind of went, but yeah, I did, it was as if she was actually there. But so, I questioned whether my mind was playing tricks on me, and I'm totally open to the possibility that it could have been. And it's a strange mixture of having felt very comforting and reassuring, but obviously at that point in my grief also very upsetting to see what you can't have, basically. Yeah, the short answer would be yes. I've done lots of learning about that. I actually, years ago, went on a study course with the lovely Roger Woolger, who is a master of past life regression and reincarnation. Rather oddly, I went into that experience really sold on the whole reincarnation thing, and then came out thinking, ooh, I'm not sure, could it be that our minds are piecing together bits of films and bits of this and bits of that? I think if I really had to come down on it, I'd say probably yes, I do. My husband's very interested in Buddhism, so he's probably the one to get a better opinion on than me, but he has lots of interesting intellectual arguments about it. I think that I do. I think that I do is the fair answer. I think so. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think.